You open your Bibles, please, to Hosea chapter 2, as we prepare our minds and our hearts to partake at the Lord's Supper this morning. Hosea chapter 2. We'll read there in a few minutes, but first, I want to tell you a story. There once was a happily married couple. Everything started off great. Their wedding was beautiful. They exchanged their vows. Their honeymoon was splendid. They bought a home together, planned to raise children. Her husband met all of her needs and more. But one day, a stunningly handsome man got a job where this wife worked. When she saw him for the first time, she was enamored by his looks. He was sharply dressed. His cologne was intoxicating. He was charming and witty. She knew she was a happily married woman, but there was something about this man she found irresistible. She could not stop thinking about him. She found herself purposely putting herself in situations where she would run into him at work so they could talk. This man did not care that she was married, and he flirted with her constantly. And though a part of her felt guilty, another part of her was filled with excitement. Over time, her husband could tell that her heart had grown cold toward him. He was losing his wife. He tried to talk to her about it, but she just gave him vague answers, never really shared what was going on in her heart. And though the husband was already doing a good job in the romance department, he tried even more to woo her and to win her back. So he decided, every week I'm going to send an anonymous gift to my wife at work. You know, the mystery will add to some of the excitement and the romance. So it was like clockwork. The husband sent a gift to her every week, sometimes flowers, sometimes candy, sometimes jewelry. But every time she opened a gift, she thought the gifts were coming from this smooth man at her office. Every time she got a gift, she would go and she would thank this handsome man at the office, and because he was not really a good person, he went along with it. Pretended like those gifts really did come from him. Meanwhile, the husband, who had been the real one giving her these gifts, would wait anxiously for his wife to call him to say thank you, to tell him how much she appreciates his love and thoughtfulness, but the phone never rang. He would wait for her to get home and wrap her arms around him in gratitude, but the subject of the gifts never came up. She didn't thank him for the gifts. It seemed like she didn't even care. No matter what the husband did, this other man had her heart. She was already at this point having an emotional affair, but eventually it became a physical affair. She cheated on her husband, and he found out about it, and it absolutely crushed his heart. And when the husband found out, he confronted her, but she denied it. The husband said, "I know what you've done because I've seen it with my own eyes. Your coworkers told me what was going on. I went to your work and I saw you holding hands with this man, and then I saw you drive off with him to a hotel." Instead of being ashamed and denying it, the wife dug her heels in and said, "He makes me feel alive. He gives me gifts every week. What have you done for me like that?" Defiantly, she stormed out and went to live with her new lover. This is the story of God and his wife, the people of Israel. They were happily married in the wilderness at Mount Sinai. They recited their vows to one another. God said, "I will be your God. You will be my people." Exodus 24, they agreed with God. They said, "All the words of the Lord has spoken, we will do." But then they met Baal, the handsome lover, who gave them intense physical pleasure and excitement, and their hearts started to grow cold toward God. God sent them gifts to woo them and win their hearts back to him, but every time God gave them a gift, they thought it came from Baal. Hosea chapter 2, verse 5. Their mother has played the harlot. She has conceived them. She who has conceived them has acted shamefully, for she said, "I will go after my lovers who gave me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink." Drop down to verse 8. She does not know that it was I who gave her the grain the new wine and the oil and lavished on her silver and gold, which they then used for Baal. And God says, it was me sending you those gifts all along. Baal does not care about you. He's only using you. But when God confronted Israel through the prophets, they denied it. They said, what are you talking about? Everything is fine between us and God. Don't tell us we're cheating on God with Baal. That's nonsense. And when the prophets pressed them and said, God sees, He knows everything that is going on. He has witnessed it firsthand. He has seen your harlotry. He has seen your unfaithfulness. They dug their heels in and said, well, Baal gives us gifts. What have you ever done for us, God? And they went off to live with their new lover. Question, husbands, what would you do if your wife stomped on your heart like this? And I could ask it in reverse. Wives, what would you do if your husband stomped on your heart like this? You know, in Matthew 19, when Jesus said that sexual infidelity in marriage is the only justifiable reason for divorce, I think that's because Jesus knows sexual infidelity is the one thing in marriage that can cause irreparable damage. The physical consequences of a spouse's decision to cheat can destroy a marriage forever. And in the case of the wife that we are talking about in Hosea, this wasn't just a momentary lapse of judgment or a quick moment of weakness. This wife was blatantly cheating on her husband. And when he called her out on it, she told him she didn't care, and she kept right on cheating with him. Cheating on him. And in the case of Israel, she wasn't just cheating with one man at the office, she was prostituting herself out to many different men. Husbands, would you still try to win her back after that? I know I'm not married, but number one, I'm not sure it would be possible to win her back at that point. I mean, what more could I do? And secondly, I'm not sure I would want her back anyway after the way she treated me. Yet look what God says to His rebellious, wayward harlot of a wife. Verse 14, Hosea 2. Therefore, behold, I will allure her. I will bring her into the wilderness and speak kindly to her. God still chooses to pursue her. He says, I will allure her back to me. When it says, speak kindly, the phrase literally means speak upon her heart. God says, I will speak to her heart and win her back to me. What? How could he still want her back? And how could he think that this is even possible after the way that she has so hardened her heart against him? And how is this even fair or right? The wife is the one who is in sin. She should be the one coming back to try to woo the husband back and to beg and to grovel for him to forgive her and to take her back. But instead it is the husband still reaching out, still trying to pursue and to allure her. The husband who has been so wronged, so violated, so trampled on, is still chasing her and will not let her settle for the shallow, empty relationship with Baal. God knows she only thinks that Baal is what's best for her, but He knows better. Baal may provide momentary excitement, but God is her husband, and only He can give her what she truly needs. Baal does not care about her. He's only using her, and God says, I'm going to find her, and I'm going to convince her that she is with the wrong man, and she needs to come home. Well, how's God going to do that? Well, in the second part of verse 14, He says, I will bring her into the wilderness and speak to her heart. In other words, He's going to bring her back to the place where they first met and remind her why they fell in love in the first place. Look in verse 15. I will give her her vineyards from there in the valley of Achor as a door of hope, and she will sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. In other words, it'll be like back in the days when they were young newlyweds. The wilderness was the place they came after God rescued them from Egyptian slavery and first proposed. The wilderness was the place where it was just her and God, where He protected her from all her enemies, where He provided for her every need, where she learned that she could trust and depend on a God who would never abandon her and never forsake her. Verse 16, it will come about in that day, declares the Lord, that you will no longer call me Ishi, and you will no longer call me, I read that wrong, that you will call me Ishi, and will no longer call me Baali. Ishi meaning you will call me my husband, no longer my Baal. When God does this, she'll never think God's gifts were from Baal ever again. In fact, she won't ever mention this handsome guy at the office's name again, and she won't ever even think about him again. Verse 17, I will remove the name of the Baals from her mouth, so that they will be mentioned by their names no more. And God and His people will renew their covenant and be happily married again. Continue reading down through verse 20, starting in verse 18. In that day, I will also make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, and the creeping things of the ground, and I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and will make them lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in loving kindness and in compassion, and I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. Then you will know the Lord. Now let's get more specific about how all this will happen. Because at the end of verse 15, he says the valley of Achor will be a door of hope. Now, the valley of Achor was the place where Achan and his family were stoned to death for stealing from God. Remember, when they first went into the land of Canaan, the very first city that they conquered was Jericho. And because that was kind of the first fruits of their conquerings, God says that city and all the spoils belong to me. Well, Achan actually stole from the city of Jericho, and in doing so stole from the Lord. And because of his sin, the entire camp was affected and were not able to move forward in future conquests. They were defeated at Ai after that sin from Achan. It was not until Achan was killed that the sin was removed from the camp and the people had new hope to move forward. Likewise, in the future, there was coming another man who would die to remove the sin from Israel. When Achan died, sin was removed from Israel. There was new hope. When Jesus dies, sin will be removed in an even greater sense from the camp. And He will bring the ultimate hope to move forward. This, I believe, is the key to understanding how God would allure His people back to Him. Think about it. When John the Baptist, hundreds of years later, came preaching a message of repentance, where did he call the people out to? The wilderness. John was a voice crying in the wilderness, calling people back out to the place where they first fell in love with God, where they first committed their vows to Him in a faithful covenant, where they first learned to trust Him and to depend on Him to meet all of their needs. John set the scene for Jesus, who would provide this ultimate act of kindness for Israel. Jesus' death on a cross for our sin would speak to Israel's heart and win her back to God. Keep a marker right here in Hosea, because we'll be right back. Look at one verse with me in John 12. John 12. Listen to the interesting way Jesus speaks about His own death on a cross and what it would do. In John 12, Jesus says this in verse 32 and 33. John 12, 32 and 33. And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. But He was saying this to indicate the kind of death by which He was to die. By being lifted up on a cross, God's wayward wife would see just how much her unfaithfulness cost God. She would see just how much God was willing to give up in order to allure her back to Him. The cross would draw her back. In the end, this horribly rebellious wife would see that her husband, who should have hated her, her husband who should have divorced her, who should have moved on with his life and never wanted to see her again, instead shows her the greatest act of love she had ever seen. And when she compared the depth of her husband's love for her to the shallow fling that she'd been having with this man from the office, there was no comparison. And if you flip back to Hosea chapter 3, one more verse, verse 5, there's a prophecy here that says, Hosea 3:5, afterward, the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they will come trembling to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. That's what his wife did. She came trembling back to her husband in shame over the atrocity of her behavior, groveling, begging for his forgiveness, trembling in fear that she may have caused irreparable damage to their relationship. But the husband who gave everything to allure her back with his goodness, he welcomes her back. He embraces her. They renew their vows, and she never betrays him again because his love for her has changed her heart forever. And as we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, please realize that you and I were the unfaithful wife who cheated on God with Satan, the handsome man at the office. And as we partake of the bread that represents Jesus' body and the fruit of the vine which represents his blood, we are remembering what our husband did to allure us back to him. We are remembering that he spoke to our hearts, that his love is beyond compare. We are renewing our vows, in a sense, with him and rejoicing that we can be married happily ever after to the one who meets all of our needs. Let's think about these things as we partake.